From Unity Church of Christianity in Houston, Texas, this is The Awakened Life with Rev Howard Caesar. Unity is a non-denominational Christian church providing a positive, practical, and progressive approach to Christianity. Let's join the service in progress with the Rev Howard Caesar.
And so I have a question to ask you, and that is, have you established your mission for the coming year? Yes, okay. And does it complement your mission in life? And do you have clarity on what your mission in life is? And I hope to bring clarity to that if need be. You see, there is only one mission that we all share in this life, and that we all have been given. You know what that is? I'll let you know just a second. There is actually a book that some of you are familiar with. It's a book that we study here in Unity, a familiar book. It's called Lessons in Truth, and it's written by Emily Cady. And Emily Cady was a great spiritual teacher. She was very clear. She was filled with heart. She was filled with the Spirit. She was an inspired woman, and she wrote several books, and one of them was Lessons in Truth. And in the first chapter of that book, which is titled Bondage or Liberty, which? In other words, we're always making a choice and a decision whether we're going to live and remain in bondage or whether we're going to be set free. And she shows the way. She makes it clear that our mission is, she writes, the ultimate aim of every man, woman, person should be to come into the consciousness of an indwelling God. And then, in all external matters, to affirm deliverance through and by this divine one. In other words, there is a divine presence, and it's indwelling. It's an indwelling God. On another page in that same chapter, she states, each man, woman, person must sooner or later learn to stand alone with his God. Nothing else avails. Nothing else will ever make you master of your own destiny. Puts great importance on this indwelling God and becoming conscious of it and entering into relationship with it. She goes on to say, there is in your own personal indwelling Lord all that you can ever need or desire. It's all there. We think it's all out there that we want it, but it really is initiated from within. And she talks about a process, and she talks about stages that a person goes through. And she says that man is often first living in kind of the selfish part of himself, and that he has to grow up through various stages and by various processes to having this spiritual understanding wherein he knows that he is really one with the Father. And in gaining this awareness is free of suffering because he has attained conscious dominion over all things. Now we need to really get into the place that says what she's talking about exists, all right? There are masters and mystics that have talked about that. It is a journey that they have been on, a pathway that they have achieved various levels of. So it exists. She says that somewhere on this journey that we're on, the human consciousness or intellect comes to a place where it gladly bows to its spiritual self, gladly bows to its spiritual self, and confesses that this spiritual self, it's Christ, its indweller, is highest and is Lord. It's like a total acknowledgement that there is this something living within you, indwelling you, that you continue to turn to, and your mission is to get in touch with it and live from it, okay? So the journey is really then a movement internally from separation consciousness toward oneness consciousness. And she says that everyone must sooner or later come to this point or this experience. There's a point that you reach at some point in this journey where that you bow to that. You bow with your whole being. It's at different places in time in different people's lives. Liberty or freedom, at a deep level, is something that awaits us all. We may not see this for ourselves. We may not necessarily figure out how that could happen for us, a total freedom. But you have to realize that it has been, this freedom, this liberty, it has been determined for us. It has already been determined for us that this is the road we are all on. Let me tell you something that Jesus said flat out in the Gospel of John, chapter 15. You can go there if you like. But he said this. He said, "You have not chosen me, but I have chosen you and ordained you, appointed you." Wow. We don't even have to choose him. We have been chosen by him. In other words, there is a dimension of me that lives in you. There is an indweller. There is an indwelling divine, Christ, Lord of your being. Okay? And because you're here and you're alive, you're already chosen. We're all chosen ones. We really are. But we're not all awake to that. That's a point along the journey. So it happens in stages, And the great example in this process of staging and moving along this journey a great example is found in the Pentateuch. Okay, and I don't know, some of you may know what the word Pentateuch means, and actually it's the scholar's term referring to the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Okay, and in there you will find in the book of Exodus the story of Moses. All right, and it's a tremendous story that is very instructional about this process and about stages of moving from the problems of being human toward and into spiritual awakening or oneness. He depicts that. He shows us that. It's a marvelous story. And I know we're all familiar with it, but you have to realize that every time you read a story, you go deeper with it because you're not in the same place. You can read a book, put it on a shelf, you didn't get nothing out of it, take it down, somehow you're led to open that book 2 years, 5 years later, and it just speaks to you. So you're in a different place, all right? Some have said, mystics have said, that the Bible has at least 7 levels of meaning. You can read the Bible and scriptures and it speaks to you on one level, and there are other levels that take you deeper and deeper as you change and shift from where you are. It now speaks to you in new ways. And so, again, don't underestimate that fact that maybe you know the story of Moses, but there's more to be told perhaps at this moment in time in your life. And so the story is one about the children of Israel, actually, who they had strayed away from their covenant established by God through Abraham. And the people drifted away from God, and they drifted into bad habits and into basically separation consciousness from God. It was like no sense of God being in their life. They got pulled into other places and directions. They eventually found themselves then in bondage in Egypt as slaves, and with little hope that anything would ever change. Now you have to keep in mind, this was not punishment from God. This is simply the law of cause and effect. When you move into separation, you're not connected with the energies of goodness being birthed and experienced. You experience less than good based on your choices and decisions, okay? So that we create our experience and we create our reality in life. And it's either moving towards separation or it's moving towards oneness. So the people were very unhappy being slaves naturally, and they cried out to God, and a leader arose among them. And so we enter the life of Moses, which has basically 3 stages, and each one is 40 years in length. And his story is very symbolic of what really we all go through in our own spiritual development and unfoldment. It doesn't require, and it isn't really about 3 periods of 40 years. It's not about 120 years, okay? You have to remember that the number 40 in the Bible, basically it represents whatever time it takes to properly fulfill something, okay? So in other words, you can't put a numeric amount of time on it. It could be an hour, it could be a week, it could be a month, it could be 40 years, it could be 60 years. But it basically symbolizes whatever it takes to properly fulfill something, whatever time it takes for you to wake up, whatever time it takes for you to get the healing, to get to the results, to get the lesson, to get the understanding that is next up for you on that journey. So the first stage, and some have referred to it as like the first act of a play, is sometimes referred to, and it's where the Jews have been in slavery for 400 years. And if you know the story, Moses is born a slave. And at the time of his birth, the Egyptian Pharaoh has ordered all the male children of Jews to be cast into the river, killed, so as to reduce the numbers of slaves. And his mother hid him for a time, and then after a bit placed him in a basket by the riverbank, and he was floating down, and he was found by the Pharaoh's daughter. And I don't have time to tell you how and all that, but there was a sequence of events whereby Moses' real mother is appointed as the nurse to the child without them knowing that she's the real mother. And so she is able to be there with him as he's growing up and basically keep alive in him this connection to the divine. And at least that he's the knowledge of the Hebrew faith. And so in the first phase of his life, he is raised in the splendor of royalty. Okay, it's a royal palace. And he is educated in the most advanced civilization available to him at the time. He is given the latest and best knowledge in the fields of science and math and military and government and psychology and occult wisdoms and everything, okay? He is educated to become an Egyptian leader. And during this first period of Moses' life, it is all about the development of intellect, okay? His intellect and reasoning skills were trained and highly developed. And so the first act or first stage of his life basically ends with him slaying an Egyptian who is beating up a slave. And he then has to go flee for his life. And so he moves then into what is really the second phase of his journey of development. He has learned about material wealth. He has learned about the way that others can be governed, how you can govern others. He was in the palace. All that was going on. But he hadn't yet learned how to govern himself. You understand? On his journey. And so alone and afraid, he flees to the desert of Midian. And comes upon this water well, and there are 7 sisters there. And they're being, there's some bad guys there giving these girls trouble. And so he saves these 7 girls from some bad Bedouin desert people. And they then invite him to come live with the family of these girls. And he ends up marrying one and becoming a shepherd, okay? So this is a big change. Go from royalty, where you have everything all around you, now you're in the hills around sheep and shepherds. And it's just a very different kind of life, but herding sheep, but also mingling with the common people. And is an important part of his next stage of learning. And educating in regard to life, because it was here that he came to understand more the common person, and he was in what was in the hearts of the average everyday people, what caused unhappiness, what caused suffering. And he got to see what so much of humanity had to face, which he could never have learned if he had been in the palace and remained in the palace. And so this understanding was now getting balanced with this academic, intellectual head training that he had received and was living from. But more important, through this desert life and being a shepherd and in the hills, he had this sense of new solitude and quietness. And he began to rule himself from within himself. Instead of a ruler of external, became a ruler internal. And before he could become a leader, he had to gain this spiritual internal understanding. And he had lots of time now because he could be out there meditating and reflecting and connecting more deeply with the divine. And he became more teachable at an inner level. In the quietness, these things open up to you. And he had the intent to attune with God through this. And then, of course, came the mystical experience and a divine revelation. And it was the burning bush, okay? And basically, that was like an insight that came to him. And that comes with doing inner work. And some believe that it wasn't an external burning bush at all, but it was a vision that he had in which there was a light that wouldn't go out, and the light was speaking to him from within. And there was the presence of God. And from it, he experienced the power of God as the one great reality in life. That's what he got. This is the one great reality. And he received the realization that the only possibility, really, for the liberation of humanity was through a working faith in the truth of this one eternal, indwelling God. That humanity had to find within themselves a connection with this indwelling Lord of their being, and from there births a whole new dimension that removes you from any kind of bondage and limitation, and there's liberation that follows. And so his mission became one of leading and teaching and modeling the way out of bondage and into liberation, and leading the Israelites on an exodus. And he told the Pharaoh, "Let my people go," okay? And it's important that you begin to look at this story as a metaphor for a dynamic that takes place inside of us. Is this story historical? Yeah, but it actually is a story of things that happen metaphysically, if you will, or symbolically internal in us. And I'll be sharing some of that as we go along further. Excuse me. And so he was putting out the question to the people, bondage or liberty? Which? Which one do you want? Just as Emily Cady did. And from that time on, Moses identified closely with the divine. And when others saw pillars of clouds and pillars of fire, he would see God. He was always alert to the presence. He was looking for the unseen. He had the eyes of faith. His heart was beginning to open. And then we have this, and we don't have time to go all the details of it, but you know the contest that went on between Moses with his God and Pharaoh. There were the displays of magic. There were various plagues that happened, and the death of the firstborn, which is known now as the Passover. And finally, it got to the place where the people were able to leave and flee from Egypt, all, however, with the armies of Pharaoh following not far behind them. And then there is the great event that we've all heard about and read about, which was the Red Sea, okay, where Pharaoh thought he could catch up and stop them. And actually, you know, there's an interesting story. Perhaps you heard about the youngster who came home from Sunday school class, and his dad asked him what he had learned that day. And the boy said he learned about Moses crossing the Red Sea. His dad said, "Oh, really? Tell me about it." He said, "Well, Moses was helping his people escape from Egypt, and the Pharaoh came to chase them in chariots. And when the Hebrews got to the Red Sea, they built a pontoon bridge and crossed over. And when the Egyptians got there and tried to cross the bridge, Moses called in heavy artillery on his walkie-talkie and blew it up." His father says, "Did they tell you that?" The boy said, "No, but you would never believe the story they told me." So there is a tremendous teaching here in what was affirmed at the juncture of reaching a barrier where it seems like you can't find a way. And it's a powerful thing, those powerful words in which Moses, this leader now, says to the masses, "Fear not, stand firm and see. See that which the Lord will work for you today." Okay? And as Emily Cady says, sooner or later, every person must learn to take a stand with their God and truth. We're going to hit Red Seas. We're going to hit barriers. And we have to take a stand at some point in time. You see, we have to get to the place where we know we can take a stand, where we are actually able to stand firm in the connection that we have made with an indwelling God. And so what's your Red Sea? Is it a little Red Sea? Is it a big Red Sea? Is it a bunch of Red Seas? You know, and we've had them as we've gone along. Maybe you're not facing one now. But it's what do you need to cross over and get beyond inside of you. It's not something external. We always think the problem's out there. No. The Red Sea that you have to cross is inside of you. Okay, that's the barrier. And then once you cross that, you get into the wilderness, and I call it the bewilderness, because we're bewildered, Okay, we crossed that barrier, but man, we're in new territory. Now what do I do? And who am I? And all of these different things. And it's a difficult time. And so, again, as the story plays out, it is a lonely and dreary place. And it was difficult for them to find even food and water. But God always met their needs through Moses, who was now this leader, who was this connecting line to the divine. And still, the people complained, and they murmured, that there wasn't enough food and water, that the days were too hot and the nights were too cold, and they began to mumble about, well, at least they had security when they were slaves, and at least knew where their food was coming from. And so they lost their perspective on heading toward a grander life. And they were beginning to murmur about, oh, maybe I can settle for. We do that in our mind. But eventually, Moses moved them out of that fragmentation. He began to get them organized into groups and divisions and established a chain of command and began to break that up. And the mission of Moses was to lead the Israelites out of bondage and into, symbolically, what is the promised land? Happiness, bliss, joy, harmony, well-being, connectedness, oneness, love. Spiritually, it was to demonstrate that the Exodus, you need to get this, to demonstrate that the Exodus is possible for all people. That's the inner story here. To become free from our self-imposed bondage in regard to life. It's an inner Exodus that we can make. And so the whole story is a parallel, really, for us and our lives and our experience of growing spiritually. And there's a choice to be made by all of us, bondage or liberty. Which? Bondage or liberty, which, And when we take a stand for liberty, we then have begun our own exodus. Things begin to happen. And so this is our story. Everyone realizes it's easy to drift away into bad habits in thought, word, deed, just like the Israelites did. Many a person begins the journey with all their attention and focus directed on the outer effects of life. Everything is about facing the outer and dealing with it from an outer perspective. We may think we know spiritual truth, but we've only grasped spiritual truth at an intellectual level. We've often trained our mind intellectually to kind of know all the stuff. We may even know the verses. We know what to say. We grasp truth only with the mind, not with our heart, but that's not enough. You see, it hasn't been internalized. It hasn't been experienced. It hasn't been tasted. We know about it, but we really don't truly know it, okay? So our next step after living in the intellect for a while, and I can relate to this in my life, having it all in the head, and eventually the next stage is you internalize it. You begin to feel. You begin to make a connection. You retreat through meditation and prayer and quietness and reflection and listening in the silence. You become teachable at the heart level. You become helpless. And helpless can be a good thing if out of helplessness you're turning only to the divine, not looking for answers out there, but you listen inside deeply. You begin to rely on the spiritual truth as a source of inspiration. It becomes experiential, and you become a burning bush inside. The burning bush begins to live inside you. And at this point, we have a leader, a prominent, leading spiritual thought, an inspirational thought or calling that rises up. Haven't you ever received, in the midst of something, you get a thought, and it's an idea, and it's from on high. It rises up. It's inside of us. It's like an internal Moses, and somehow it's able to lead all our other thoughts, a nation of thoughts, because we have them oftentimes fragmented. They're all over the place, a nation of thoughts and feelings. And this one thought emerges, and it wants to take us beyond all our past negative patterns. And it's like a God intention. And then the battle rages with the ruling Pharaoh, our ego, okay? It wants to keep us in separation. And then we have the Red Sea, which is the collective consciousness, the voices of the world and the voices of, and the ways of the world, of separation. We have to learn to fear not, to stand firm and see what God can do and not cave in, not let the Red Sea win over us. And there are multitudes of thoughts that continue to complain and murmur against this leading God intention that says, there's something more here. There's something greater here. And then there's, no, you can't do it. Nah, this is the way. The world's voices and ways come in that say, nah, it's all about suffering. It's all this or that. And you have to push past that. You have to stand firm. There is a promised land. There is a sense of fulfillment waiting for us when this higher voice, this Moses within, takes over and silences the Pharaoh and takes us on a journey past the Red Seas, through the wildernesses, allows us to be teachable. That's the mission. Do you know what your mission is now? Your mission is to find that Moses in you, the leader, the leading God-connected thought. That one thought that will rise up and lead the nation of thoughts in you to your indwelling God. Beyond the doubts, beyond the murmurings to turn back, beyond the Red Seas, through the wildernesses, to the promised land, to a sense of fulfillment. So find the Moses in you that will fear not, that will stand firm, and that is able to see, no matter what God is going to do for you. Happy New Year. God bless you.
When your eyes turn to the window pane, to the lights upon the hill, the distance seems so strange to you now, and the dark room seems so still. Let your pain be my sorrow. Let your tears be my tears too. Let your courage be my motto, that the north you find will lead you true. And when there's no information and the compass spins to nowhere, to nowhere, just let your soul be your pilot. Let your soul guide you. Let your soul guide you. Let your soul guide you. It'll guide you well. Guide you well. Let your soul guide you. Let your soul guide you. Let your soul guide you. Let your soul.
Thank you for joining us for today's message. We invite you to be with us again next Sunday. At Unity, we believe that God's presence of love and goodness is everywhere, and that life is meant to be good. You can find out more about Unity and our teachings at unityhouston.org.